So this sikha, very powerful sikha, but very in depth. I've seen a shir on the sikha that goes as long as 3.5 hours. So we're going to try to squeeze it in. Ultimately, it is a sikha on Parshas Beshalach. It's also a Siyum on Maseches Eiruvin. And the Siyum goes on as follows. It really sits on the last shtikul gemara of Eiruvin, which is a very complicated masechta, abstract, but it really goes to the heart of what an Eiruv is all about, what Shabbos is all about, what the machlokes, or rather the opinion of Rabbi Shimon versus other Tanoim is. The whole question of kamos and echos, which is something that's been explored in other sikhs. It really goes to the heart, and we're going to try to keep it relatively short, so that means we're not going to be able to go into every single detail. So how does it connect to Parshas Beshalach? Al yetze ish min kaimer b'yom hashvi. The pasuk says a person should not leave their place on the seventh day. Chazal say this, and they learn from here in Maseches Eiruvin that this is alpayim amma, this is 2,000 amas of Tchum Shabbos, that a person is not allowed to walk out of 2,000 amas beyond the city on Shabbos. You have all the way to the outskirts of the city, and then an extra 2,000 amas, or if you're living alone in a house in the middle of nowhere, you only have 2,000 amas outside your house. Now, at the end of Perek Daled in Maseches Eiruvin, which is Daf Nun Beis in the Masechta, there's a machlokes like this. It's the end of a Perek. Misha hefshit chutz letchum. It got dark, and he was outside of the Tchum Shabbos. He was heading out on a journey, and he got stuck outside Tchum Shabbos. But now he wants to go back to the city. Afilu amma achas, even if he's one amma outside the Tchum, the 2,000 amas, he's stuck, he shouldn't come back. Lo yikanis, he should not go in. Rabbi Shimon says, even if you're 15 amas beyond the boundary, yikanis, not only may you come in, the Rebbe says, you see, that yikanis, he must go in. Because the people who make the measurements and make the boundaries are not exact about it, because there's people that are going to make mistakes, and therefore they always shorten it up to 15 amas plus minus, because people will make a mistake. So therefore you could go up to 15, if you're 15 amas beyond, you could go still back in, because technically you're still in the Eiruv. Now, the Rav Shimon leaves it there. It's a very small shtikul gemara on the Mishnayos over there. And only 50 blot later, at the end of the Maseches Eiruvin, does it say the following. Rav Shimon says, whenever Chachamim gave you permission to do something, they gave you a heter. It's not that they removed a prohibition and gave you a heter, but rather they gave you something that was already yours. As in, the 15 amas were yours anyway. And when they permitted you, they only permitted you by shvus, which seems to be, what does that even mean? We'll explain. The Gemara explains that over here he's saying two different points. Point number one, that whenever they gave you a permission, it was something that was already yours, refers to the Mishnah we spoke about earlier, Daf Nun Beis, that the 15 amas are yours anyway. But when it says they only permitted you shvus and nothing else, that refers to a Mishnah that's much later in the Masechta, just 2-3 blocks before the end, Kuf Beis, which over there says, regarding if a harp in the Beis HaMikdash, which was played even on Shabbos, the harp of a Levi was ripped, a cord, then you can tie the cord in the Beis HaMikdash, but not outside the Beis HaMikdash. You could do it if it happened. In other words, you can lechatchila go do it. If something was ripped, then you could go fix it. But Shimon over there comes and says, in the Daisa, he says you cannot tie it, oinva, you could just make a bow. And over there he explains, in other words, in our final mission of the Masechta and Kuf Hey, he explains, the reason you're allowed to only make a bow is because they only allowed you to do something which is a shvus, which is a low category of prohibition, but something d'oraisa or d'rabbanan you're not allowed to do, and tying would be problematic. So therefore, Tying, which could lead to Chiyuv Chatos, Rabbanan did not allow. Aniva, bow, which wouldn't lead to Chiyuv Chatos, they did allow. Now, the Rebbe is coming and trying to understand. Fundamentally, it's a question that Rashi grapples with, Tosfos, and many other Mefarshim. Why at the end of the Masechta, in a Mishnah that technically talks about something else entirely, it talks about the law of sheretz. If you find a dead sheretz in the Beis Hamikdash, how do you take it out, whether Shabbos or during the weekday? So the Mishnah talks about the option of either taking it out with sticks or taking it out with the aniva, with the belt of the kohen. And somehow then Rab Shimon decides to bring two reasons for halachas that he said, one in Daf Nun Beis and one in Daf Kuf Beis. Why? What's he trying to say? How does it enter the sugya? What's the connection? Now, Tosfos comes and tells us that he's coming to explain that he has to say, listen, in one place he is lenient, in one place he is not lenient, he's strict. So to give you explanation why in the case of the Eruv he's lenient and the case of the bow he's strict, therefore he has to give the reasons. But the question is, so why does it have to be put here? You should put it back in Daf Nun Beis, or at least Daf Kuf Beis. But what does that have to do with the Mishnah of Sheret Shenimtza B'Mikdash, which has nothing to do with the concept? Now Rashi, he offered and said that what Rab Shimon was coming and saying is, even though I am lenient in Machshir, I am serious by Kinor, because over there it was Mishalcha, and over here Mishum Shvus. Now, according to Rashi, what's the connection between the two? In other words, why would I think because I was makel by Hechshich, Chutz L'Tchum, the Tchum Shabbos, I should be makel by Kshur? What's the connection? Just because I'm makel one place, I have to be makel in the rest of Shas? What's the connection between these two sukkahs? So that comes and explains the whole concept of what Erev Chatzeris is all about. Shulchan Aruch tells us in Siman Shin Tzadik Hey, that the whole concept of Chatzeris and why you should make sure that there's an Eruv Chatzeris or Shitufim Avos, which is a different kind of Shituf, a different kind of Eruv that's made not between Chatzeris, between Mavoi, which is a whole, pretty much the majority of Maseches Eiruvin. That is because it's there for your pleasure. Kedei l'tayil, so you should be able to walk around or bring your food from place to place, and that is part of Oinek Shabbos. That's what the Prisha explains. Now, if the whole concept of Tchumen is Oinek Shabbos, so therefore the being within 2,000 Amos is a pleasure, because then you could actually live. If you're locked out of Tchum Shabbos, out of the 2,000 Amos, then you're actually not having pleasure, which is the opposite of pleasure. So, according to Rab Shimon, he would say you have to come back into the 2,000 Amos. You have to come back into your Tchum Shabbos, even though you might be outside of it, because every minute that you're outside, you're going to lose Einik Shabbos. Now, even though Rab Shimon says it might be the 15 Amos are yours anyway, there's no question that you shouldn't lechatchila go do it. It's a problem, the fact that you're coming back, because first of all, we're not exact that every time they give 15 Amos, maybe they give 10 Amos. And the point is the person caused a problem. He did something wrong. It's an Isser. The Rabbi talks about Nora 18. But nevertheless, because the amount of time you'll be spending outside the rest of the 24 hours of Shabbos is a tremendous amount of quantity where you're going to lose out on the pleasure of Shabbos, that overrides the echos, the quality, the one prohibition that you're going to do, which is coming back into the Tchum Shabbos. In other words, as we said, Rab Shimon says you have to come back. You have to. You have to walk in, because every moment that you're out, you're still in prohibition. Even though you might be over an Isser of Tchum Shabbos by coming in, we're not sure, but you might be. Nevertheless, rather do one than the other, because one is a once off, and Rab Shimon says the other one is constant. So Kamos overrides Echos. Now, if we say that Kamos overrides Echos, we can now understand the principle that Rab Shimon, why he has to bring first Makom Sheitir Lecha Mishalcha Nasnucha, and then the Klal Shleitir Lecha Mishum Shvus. Why? Because when it comes to fixing the cord on the kinar, each one has a chumrah that the other one doesn't have. Why? Because if I tie the cord, even though it might lead to an incredible isser, because I might make a tie that's going to be permanent, and that's a isser. Nevertheless, it's once off. However, if I make a bow, it's weak. So each time I'm playing with the instrument, I might rip, and I might be having to make the bow multiple times. So you might have thought that in the case of the bow, again, kamas should override echos, and therefore the many prohibitions, the many times you're going to have to make the bow, should be more serious than one time making a tainat. So then why does Rab Shimon say do both? L'chura, based on the logic that Rab Shimon overrides kamas over echos, kamas should win. So he has to come and tell you no. Why? Because shleitir lecha, the only time I permitted and I said that kamas overrides echos is when they're both at the same level of prohibition, when they're both a shvus, when they're both at the same category. However, when it comes to fixing the kinar, it's one is that could lead to a deiraisa, and one is a kamas to rabbanan. If I make a permanent knot, it might lead to deiraisa. If I forget to untie it after Shabbos, or if I lose my intention, it can lead to deiraisa. A deiraisa echus is more powerful than a derabbanan kamas. And what's the raya? From the fact that Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch, if there was a sick person who had a sakana, then if he needs meat to eat, they shechta for him. You don't say, let's go give him a nevela. In other words, a dead animal that's anyways dead that we don't have to shecht. Why? Because by a nevela, each kazayis that you eat is a isser. By shchita, it's a once-off. Now, you should say, based on the fact that kamas overrides, that over here kamas should win, and you should eat a lot of nevelas. But what's the answer? It's clear. Because only when both are doidaisas does one override. But the nevela is a doidaisa, and the shchita, the Shabbos. Sorry, the halacha over there says Alter Rebbe brings Shulchan Aruch. If a chayil was a sakana and he needs meat, you shecht, and you don't say let's give him nevela, because nevela is an isur, which nevela is an isur lav, and shchita would be a isur skila. The answer is why? Because nevela, you're over on every kazayis. Shchita is a once-off, even though it's more serious. So over here it says echus will override kamas, but over there in the same halacha it says, if you have to cook up wine, the yid should fill up the wine, but the kuti, the non-Jew, should warm it, even though it will be an isur medivei soifim. Why should the kuti do it? Over there we explain, because when it is the exact same thing, in other words, when the nevela is a doiraisa and the shchita is a doiraisa, the shchita is a once-off, so therefore the shchita wins because kamas overrides echos. However, when it comes to stam yenam, the chashash of yain nesech, which is a dirabanan, so therefore the echos of doiraisa, which is me turning on the fire and cooking the wine, is a bigger prohibition than the guy making the wine and me tasting the guy's wine, even though it's a constant. Every taste of wine I'm having a stam yenam, because it's a doiraisa over a dirabanan. In other words, what is proof is from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch is that the only time that the argument of echos and kamas actually comes into play, and you could say that kamas overrides echos, is when they're the same category. But if it's a totally different quality of echos, in other words, it's a totally different isser, one is a doiraisa, one's a dirabanan, it doesn't override. So when does Rab Shimon say that kamas and echos, kamas overrides? When they're both within the same category. But when they're not the same category, he doesn't hold this. And that's why we can understand why this all comes into the Mishnah of the Sheretz. Why Rab Shimon had to bring it up? Why? because the sheretz also talks about that same thing. What's the case of the sheretz? You have a sheretz in a Beis Hamikdash, and the kohen either takes it out with his belt, because to just do it as quickly as possible, that the tumah should not be. That's Rabbi Yechon Abraika. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you take 2 wooden sticks and you bring it out, which might take a little bit of time. Why? The explanation is one person holds that shihui tumah is the longer the tumah is there, the worse it is. And one person says that even though the tumah might be longer there, if you take it out with your clothing, you're creating more tumah. It's causing more of a problem. So therefore, rather do it with sticks. In other words, what overrides what? Kamus or echos. If the kamus is more important, in other words, I don't want the tumah there for another second, so then take your belt, even though your belt will be mekabel tumah from it, and you're just adding more tumah into the world. So there's more echos of tumah in the world. The other person says, no, take it out with sticks, which are not mekabel tumah, even though the tumah is going to stay longer in the Beis Hamikdash, because we don't want to make another tumah. We don't want more echos of tumah, so therefore we prefer more kamas than echos. And that is part 1 of the Fabrengen. This is a Fabrengen that the Rebbe said, Hadron that the Rebbe said on his father's yard site, the 18th yard site, Tavshin Chav Beis Chav Menachem Av. And now the Rebbe goes and explains it al pi pnimi sainyan. Says the Rebbe like this. And this is just a mind-blowing concept, the whole idea of what Maseches Eiruvin, Mershus L'Shus, what Eiruvin is all about. In the Gemara Shabbos, the Gemara starts the Masechta with the laws of Hitzah, taking out from Rishus L'Rishus. And the famous question, even it's brought on the first page, Tosfos brings it, why in the world are we bringing Hitzah at the beginning? It's the last of the 39 Malachas. The whole Maseches Eiruvin fundamentally is all about Hitzah. Hitzah is a massive part of Shabbos. Literally, you open up Maseches Shabbos, it's at least a third or a half of Maseches Shabbos is talking about various elements of Hitzah, if not more. Eiruvin, the whole Masech is talking about it. And everything else about Shabbos, Bishul, and all the other elements of Shabbos will take a much smaller space of Hitzah. Why? Because Chassidus explains, he quotes from Torah earlier, the Malacha of Hitzah, L'Shus L'Shus, is the Iker of the whole Lamates Malachas. And he brings a proof from Niglah. There's a famous Shaila in the Medrash that says the following, that a certain Abikaris asked Abba Kiva, he said like this, that if you say that Hashem respects Shabbos, then Hashem should not bring winds, Hashem should not bring rain, he should not cause things to grow, grass to grow. Now the rain argument you might say is Hitzah L'Shus L'Shus, because it's coming from heaven down to earth, but the other ones don't have to do with L'Shus L'Shus. What does Abba Kiva answer? He brings a mashal from an Eruv. And he says that in one Rishus, in my house, there's no Eiruvin because it's all my house. So too, the whole world is Hashem's. But says the Rebbe, the question that Chassidus asks, L'chor, Rabbi Kiva is only answering the question of Hitzah. He's not answering the other malachas about causing grass to grow, which is not a malacha of Hitzah, it's the whole malacha of Zriya, which has nothing to do with Hitzah. So therefore, you must say that the malacha of Hitzah is the fundamental nikuda in all the malachas of Shabbos. And it's this yisoid and the sherish of everything that comes out of Shabbos. All the others malachas, they're told us and they're shvusim. Everything comes from there. And therefore, because for Hashem there's now shaykhis of Hitzah L'Shus, because it's all his mishros, so therefore the whole foundation of the question is everything else about Shabbos falls away. And that's why we can explain why Maseches Shabbos starts with the Malachas Hitzah and why it's such a fundamental thing, because this is the fundamental nekuda of all the Lamed Tes Malachas. Why? Let's explain this according to Chassidus. What is Shabbos? Shabbos La'avaya, it's all for Hashem. Versus Yom Tov, Chetzia LaHashem, half to Hashem, and half to us. Each one of us, we split it evenly. Shabbos is Kule La'avaya. In other words, what is the fundamental idea of resting on Shabbos? Is, as it says in the Chinuch, Likboya benafshesenu, to establish in our nefesh emunas chidush ha'olam, the emunah that the world is created constantly that the Eibishter created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, and therefore not only did he create it then, but every single moment Hashem is creating it from nothing to something, ex nihilo, me'ayin liyesh. And on Shabbos, Hashem takes a rest from Aseret Mamaris, from creating the world, and rather, according to Chassidus, how does the world sustain itself on Shabbos? Not from the dibur of Hashem, but rather from the machshava of Hashem. That's what Shara Yichud Emun explains. So the Eibishter is the only thing that exists. In other words, even though the world, oilam, the world, milashon helam, which means cover up, the world can cover up this whole idea and make us convinced that there is no single ruler of this world. There's many rishuyos in this world. There's two rishuyos. There's not only the Hashem, there's something else, and maybe there's no Eibishter at all, chas v'shalom. There's good, there's bad, etc. What's the concept of Shabbos? To remember that the whole world is one Rishus Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Rishus HaYachid of the Yechidei Shalom of Melech Yachid Umiyuchad of the single king. In other words, when we do Melach on Shabbos, what are we hurting, Chas v'Shalom? What we're doing is we're weakening that Amunah, and we're strengthening the Helam, the cover up. We're strengthening the darkness of the fact that there's two Rishuyos. We're saying that there is not only a Rishus HaYachid, there's a Rishus HaRam. I have my life. I'm not giving Shabbos Lavaya. There's my life as well. So what's the foundational concept of the whole resting of Shabbos and all the Lamates Melachos? Taking out of Hashem's Rishus HaYachid, Hoitzah, Dafka Hoitzah, not Achnasa, Hoitzah, because you're taking out of Hashem's Rishus HaYachid, in theory, and you're saying that this world is not Hashem's Rishus HaYachid. So that's what Rabbi Akiva says the whole world is the Eibishter. He's saying like this. Because it's not shaykh any Helen Behester on the truth, but by Hashem, by us we can, but because by Hashem it's not shaykh to say that anything is outside of him, because everything is truly his, and when Mashiach comes, it's going to be revealed even in this world, as it says in the Medrash, that when a person is going to try to take a fig on the Shabbos, the fig is going to scream and say it's Shabbos. In other words, the world itself is going to scream, the Shush Hayachid, that this is the Shush of the Eibishter. So therefore, there's no shaykhis, there's no ability by Hashem to say Hoitzah. There's no such a thing as Hoitzah by Hashem, because the world is his. So that's what Rabbi Akiva is saying. One day we're going to acknowledge it as well. But mitzad Hashem, from Hashem's perspective, it's always the Shus HaYachid. It's only in our helam, in our confusion, in the bluff that the world that says to us that we convince ourselves that there isn't the Shus HaYachid. Says the Rebbe like this. Now, all the things of this world are split into three general sugim, which talk about the three sugya, the shuyas of Shabbos. One kind of sug is, three types. One is, and this connects interesting to Sikha that is also we learned in Chelek Yud of Parshas Vayetze, how to live with this world. So one type is that the world is, you live in a reality that everything's Kedusha, and you do Ba'asei Tov. So you're doing positive, the Shus HaYachid. Then there's things in this world which are negative, bad. And how do you deal with them in a of Sur Meirah? In other words, over here you're dealing with things which are not the Shus HaYachid, even though Be'etzem they are, they're Hashem's, but in this world they seem to be in the Shus HaRam, they seem to be a world of division, a world of that. So that's the second category of how you deal with this world. You deal with the world. There's parts of this world, mitzvah saseh, which is Shus HaYachid. There's mitzvah lo saseh, in which you're negating the fact that there might be the Shus HaRam. And then there's suk shenyani the shus. There's things where the shus, which is a medium. It's an intermediary between mitzvah and iser. Things that you're allowed to, but you don't have to. Mutter, but not chayiv. And how do you deal with them? Either kaddish atzmecha b'mutalach, make yourself holy, and in other words, hold yourself back from doing it, kedoshim to you, or elevate them to kedusha through kol masech l'shem shamayim, b'chol d'checha de'eyu, etc. So too says the Rebbe, the same thing is found in the shuyas of Shabbos, similar to this idea of the shus. There's, for example, a chotzer that has a few people living in the chotzer, or a mavoi, or a Carmelis, which these are all intermediaries between Rishus HaYachid and Rishus HaRam. And what do? According to halacha, you make an Erev Chatzeris or Shitufei Mevayos, you combine, and now you elevate it to the Shusayachid. In other words, what is the concept of Erev Tchumen, Erev Chatzeris? Erev Tchumen, which is how far you can walk, and Erev Chatzeris is combining all various houses in the courtyard. They're the same concept, even though they seem to be two. They're both called Erev, but they're two independent things. One is about how far you can walk, and one is about creating a combined home. But both of them are declaring the Shus HaYachid. You're coming and expanding the place of Kedusha. You're coming and saying, I'm expanding the place that I can walk, the Shus HaYachid, 2,000 amas. I'm expanding that my house is not only my house, but the whole courtyard. I'm expanding the place of the Shus HaYachid. And according to this, you could explain, says the Rebbe, to connect the two klalim of the Avtzon. One klal, he says, that was a concept they said regarding Tchum Shabbos, that the 15 Amos years anyway. And then he said, that they only allowed you Mishum Shvus. What was he, in other words, that the only time I say that Kamas overrides Eichos is when they're the same category. What was he trying to say? That the foundation, Shvus Miloshin Shavas, the whole point is, the hector, the whole concept is Mishum Shvus, to bring the Eibishter, the Shavas, the idea, the concept that Hashem rules over this world. So, and that it's all one concept. Both Tchumin, the only reason we allowed you to make Erev Tchumin or an Erev Shabbos or Erev Chatzeris, Shitufim Mevoyos, they're all for the same thing. Because it's the inyan of expanding the Shvus of Shabbos. Now, says the Rebbe, however, the truth is that there is a big difference between Isur Tchumin and Isur Melecha Shabbos. And so much so that they're opposite. What do I mean? General, when the prohibition of working on Shabbos, what does that mean? If I do malacha, I'm mechalal Shabbos. What's mechalal al pi Chassidus? I'm making cholal. I'm making an empty space. I'm taking out of the kedusha of Shabbos. I'm creating a void space. Chol. In other words, I'm taking out the kedusha of it, and I'm bringing negativity. I'm bringing klippa in. However, when I go outside the tchum, it's not that I'm bringing chol into Shabbos, but rather I'm taking out Shabbos. I'm pushing Shabbos beyond its boundaries into a place of klippas. Not that I'm bringing klippas into Kedusha, I'm bringing Kedusha into klippas. Why? Because every year, even though Amma Aretz Gomer, the light of Shabbos shines. As we know, Amma Aretz ain't Meshach of Shabbos. Amma Aretz does not lie on Shabbos. So when a person goes outside the tchum of Kedusha, they're bringing out the Kedusha to the place of klippas. Therefore, when I go outside the tchum, I'm bringing, every moment I'm there, I'm bringing Kedusha into the place of klippas. And therefore, according to the Avtzon, go back, because every moment you're there, you're allowing the klippas to stay. So in that element, Tchum Shabbos is different. In other words, there, Rabbi Shimon will come and say, Kamas overrides Eichos, get back, because every moment that you're there, you're bringing Kedusha into Makam HaKlippas, into a place that doesn't belong. Interesting, the Rebbe says, what's the difference between Tchum Shabbos and Tosfos Shabbos? Why am I allowed to add time on Shabbos before and after, but I'm not allowed to add Tchum Shabbos? Because he says, obviously, Torah allows you to do Tchum Shabbos. They gave you the koyach to do it. But Tchum Shabbos never allowed you to do. So in Zman, you're allowed to extend Shabbos, but in Mokim, you're not allowed to extend Shabbos. What's the lesson to each and every one of us? A Yid, the Iker Metzius of a Yid. What is a Yid? Nefesh Elikis. Chelik Elikami Mamash. And therefore, just like Hashem is higher from the source of creating the world, so much so that the Asada Mamalish Shabahem Nivda Olam, compared to Hashem is merely that Yid, it's nothing, it's Mamaris, it's just statements. So to a Yid, we're higher than the world. Elamai, the Torah says, Shes Yom Tav, you have to work 6 days. But even in the 6 days, I'm above it. Just like Hashem has to be mitzamtzim himself, almost lower himself to create the world, so too a Yid, Adam Elyon, similar to Hashem. For me, going to work is a tzimtzum. It's not where I want to be. I want to be in Kedusha. In other words, when I deal with chayil, when I deal with the world, it's a tzimtzum, it's a lowness. But what's my mahus? I'm Shabbos. I'm away from Muftin the chayil. And therefore, these two lessons, the prohibition of doing malacha and the prohibition of going to tchum, have each and every one of us in our life, because each and every one of us is a Shabbos here. We're Shabbos, even during the week, we're Shabbos. What's the lesson? The prohibition, the Isra of doing malacha at Shabbos tells us bringing physical things, gashmias, into your headspace. Even though you have to do work, but do it in your hand. Don't allow it to take over your mind. Only a kapecha is making effort, but the head is in kedusha. Don't allow, just like Isra Malacha, what did we explain? Don't make a makom chalul and allow the clip to come into kedusha. Don't allow your head to get full of this garbage. And when a person brings chayil into their mind, they're creating a chalul makom pani, a place within themselves that's void of hergish aliki. Because if we knew and we felt that Birchas Hashem Mitashid, only the wealth of Hashem is what makes us, the blessing of Hashem makes us wealthy. And the only reason I do work is for a keli. I would never have brought my head into this business. Why? Because my head's not there. My head wants to be in Torah. Says the Rebbe, but then this is part 2. Even someone who does not bring the asik into their Shabbos, into their head, they have to know there's another prohibition. Don't go out of the tchum. What does that mean? That in the time of Torah mitzvahs, do not go beyond the boundary of Torah mitzvahs. Torah mitzvahs has to permeate you entirely. In other words, don't use any of your kaiches outside of Torah mitzvahs. Engulf yourself fully in Torah mitzvahs. Don't cross boundaries. I'm trying to maybe understand what he's saying is also don't push the boundaries. Don't weaken the boundaries. Don't take Torah mitzvahs beyond it. You might even do, shlichus. Don't reach beyond it. And this lesson, this powerful lesson, is here for each and every one of us in the role of Shabbos.